Oh, howdy all, grab yourselves a beer, it is time for some Path of Exile discussion. In fact, maybe grab yourselves two, because we're talking about the big news of the day was, of course, the 3.9 patch notes hitting. Now, there's a lot to digest in these, I'm going to try and move through them quickly, but because it is such a long document, I highly recommend reading it all yourself. I'm going to point out the things that I feel are highlights. I'm definitely going to miss some things that will matter to certain builds, so definitely have a read of these yourself, especially if you're planning to design builds. First up, there's a section on the Metamorph Challenge League. There's no real new information in here. Definitely read this if you haven't been following anything else on Metamorph. I did a video on the Metamorph, what we knew about it at the time. There's not really anything more here, so have a look at it at some point. Next up, we have the major new content and features section, which talks about the Conquerors of the Atlas content and some of the new support gems that are being added, some of the new uniques, and mentions the 14 divination cards. We did actually get the name of the 14th and final one. That was revealed in this information, which is the patch notes, item filter, and passive tree information page. All we know about it is the name, and the name is Underground Forest. So here's the 14 divination cards. I did a discussion where I talked through 12 of them. One was revealed since then, which is Chimera's Cut. That is a divination card, a set of 2 for a random scarab. So Chimera's Cut could be an interesting divination card in that it will add a lot of unwanted scarabs into trade leagues, which will be useful because one person's trash is another person's treasure, unless of course that trash is a tormented spirit one, in which case it will probably remain trash. Also, Voltaxic Rift got buffed. Definitely have a look at that if you haven't seen it already. But that's all there really is in this section on major new content and features. A good deal of this is stuff that's been discussed before. Next up, we have the minor new content and features. I've already discussed the item filters things. Most of this is about graphical changes. But in substance, there's a couple of new enchants, and there will be a trade recipe, vendor recipe involving spare catalysts. I expect that this vendor recipe will be required for one of the league challenges, so we'll have to figure out what it is. It's probably going to be something really simple. It might just be turn in 3 of one and get back 1 of a different type, but we'll find that out in practice. Next up, we have the Atlas of Worlds changes summarized. Mostly old information. The one thing that is new, however, is that Zana will sometimes sell influenced maps. So that's Shaper and Elder maps at various points. So she's definitely worth checking her stock. There's also a mention later that she will be selling Synthesis unique maps as well, although that's apparently very rare. The vast majority of Synthesis unique maps that you get will come via other means, but you'll have a chance of getting them there too. There's a little bit of discussion about Blight and how it looks like what they've done here. They've mentioned that there's Cassia will say some nonsense early on because we haven't updated her script yet. Sorry. The sense that I get here, and from a lot of things about 3.9, is that GGG were running a bit tight on time to make the deadline of the 13th, that they'd set themselves to release the event, to release it, and what they've done is they've gone through and ruthlessly prioritized, okay, what things need to be right on release, and what things don't matter. And Cassia saying a few things she doesn't need to say is in the this doesn't matter category, so for that reason, I'm pretty happy with that. They've made that decision. And then, you know, maybe by 3.9.1 or 3.9.2, they might revisit that and slightly tweak what Cassia says. Now, I have the section on character balance. And a quick note I want to make before discussing any of the content here is about nerfs and my philosophy on them. I judge them on do they make the game more fun. Now, fun comes from content being engaging and from players having the potential to fail. Potentially failing over and over again. So for that reason, I find that builds that trivialize the entire game are actually quite antithetical to having fun playing it, and overpowered skills just mess with fun in general. Nerfing overpowered skills is a net positive for fun. Nerfing weak skills is a net neutral for everyone except for the players for whom that skill is a pet skill, and for those people it's a net negative. I think the worst outcome comes when you nerf a skill that is good enough but not great. And there's a couple of nerfs I want to criticize, and there's a couple that I enthusiastically support. I'm not going to go through every single change that's been made because it's, there's thousands of words here, and we'll be here until, well, I only said to take out 2 beers, so you might find yourself running out by that time. So I'm just going to go through the things that I found particularly interesting. If you've got a skill in mind, though, and you've decided what you want to play, then definitely do a quick bring up this page and press Control F to search through and type in the name of the skill, just in case you are planning on playing something that has been completely gutted. So, Fortify has been nerfed, but only for players that took it to extremes, and its interaction with Abyssus has been indirectly buffed. And that's where they're saying here, Fortify's damage reduction effect is now multiplicative with other similar effects. If you have other effects that are similar to Fortify, and so there is Abyssus which goes the other way, Abyssus being increased damage and on yourself as its drawback for being such an overpowered helm, and then there are items like Unshattered Will that gives you a decreased damage taken. These will stack in a way that is unfavourable when you're reducing them and favourable when you're increasing them. So basically, think of it this way, Fortify is no different for most players, but is weaker for players that were using Unshattered Will, stronger for players that were using Abyssus, but for most players it will be no difference. There have been some interesting changes to Shock and Chill here. Now, the way that it's changing is so that Shock and Chill effects are going to scale based upon the amount of damage you do to a monster, but they're going to scale very slow, very gradually compared to the damage you do. So it's a sublinear scaling. If you do 2.5 times the hit damage, then the Shock effect or Chill effect will be multiplied by 1.44. If you do 5.7 times the damage, you'll get double the Shock or Chill effect. If you do 15 times the damage, you'll roughly triple the Shock or Chill effect. And if you do 32 times the hit size, you'll roughly get 4 times the effect of Shock or Chill. What this means is that for most players, you're going to be able to inflict minimum effect chills and shocks on pretty much everything, but getting the massive shocks and the massive chills, the ones that basically render an enemy unable to move in the case of a chill. Well, unable to move is an exception, but render them basically harmless because you can just so easily dodge all of their attacks, or shocks that just make them take escalating amounts of damage. These are going to only be these sorts of massively powerful elements, only things you can only inflict on the weakest of enemies, and most of which you'll kill in one shot anyway. So overall though, I think this is going to be a net positive for most players, and it'll be a net negative for the very hardest hitting builds. Starforge builds will dislike this change, but I think, especially Starforge builds that use things like Heavy Strike or Sweep to deal I don't think you can use Sweep, but Heavy Strike. There's just one massive wallop with Starforge. That's not going to be as good as it used to be. But doing consistent hits, I think you'll find most characters will get better here. Skill balance. I can't talk about every skill that's been changed. The reworks I've discussed elsewhere, or at least I've discussed Explosive Arrow at a bit of length, and Shrapnel Shot I think I've just touched on. But for changes to existing skills that are more of a numerical change rather than an overhaul. Arc. The chain range has been partially restored. The reason that Arc used to be overpowered as all hell once was not so much the damage it deals. The damage it deals was pretty good since the overhaul, but that wasn't the reason people played it. The reason people played Arc was because it could deal damage around multiple corners, but more importantly, it could just kill enemies before you even saw them. And if you kill an enemy before you see it, then you've killed that enemy probably before it sees you, and therefore it poses no threat to you whatsoever. Now that version of Arc that was brokenly overpowered had a chain range of 50. This was cut in half in a really savage nerf that was intended to just say, okay, this skill has been too powerful for too long, we're going to smash it with the nerf bat. It's still going to be okay for dealing with dense packs, but it's not going to spread beyond one pack. Now they're partially restoring that range to 35. I think this is going to be a really good change. However, there's something very counterintuitive about this skill now. And that is that because Arc requires nearby enemies to function at its fullest power level, Arc is much stronger if you are playing maps that have massive amounts of additional monsters on them. So for instance, if you're using triple sextanted maps, assuming that you can still apply 3 sextants, we don't know exactly how sextants will work in 3.9 yet, but if you're running triple sextanted maps that have 30% increased pack size from map mods, then in that case, you'll find you'll get great chaining from Arc. At least that's my expectation. We'll have to see it in practice. On the flip side, if you're playing a more sparsely populated map, let's say that you've just transmuted a low tier map and started running it because you want to just get your Atlas bonus up at the start of the league, or you're not yet confident to do rare maps, then in that case I think you'll find Arc will be less impressive. Its ability to chain is going to be constrained by the fact that it will be further to the nearest pack, and so for that reason I think Arc is going to be a late bloomer skill. However, Arc still does extraordinary damage early on, and so I'm not opposed to players trying this as a league starter. It's not my plan to do so. I'm personally bored with Arc. I've run it 3 times before. Once as a trapper, once as a miner, and once as a self-cast. I think, no, yeah, that's right. And I'm just basically over the skill, but I do think it will work pretty well. Lastly, Arc has always synergized well with traps and mines. That is because Arc has a long cast time, and traps and mines sort of cheat that in a way. So essentially, a trap or a mine version of Arc is extremely powerful. It exploits the flat cast time of traps and mines, and so I highly recommend considering an Arc miner or an Arc trapper if you're planning to use this skill. You can do that as a saboteur, or if you're planning to go the mines route, then you can play it with other builds as well. You don't need to be a saboteur to play those types of skills. So the next skill I want to discuss quickly is Blast Drain. Blast Drain is a skill that my gut is currently saying, and I haven't run any numbers on this, that because the best stat for this skill is plus to projectiles, so Shaper plus arrows, Implicit Corrupted, Val plus arrows, Dying Sun, Awakened Greater Multiple projectiles, I'm going to advise people not to league start this skill lightly. I think that Dying Sun's going to be expensive, and all of these ways of scaling extra projectiles are going to be expensive. So for that reason, Blast Drain may end up being a powerful skill. I haven't done the maths to be sure, but it does have that serious problem that it is just difficult to, it is going to be difficult to get enough extra arrows without expensive investment. Next one I want to discuss is Caustic Arrow. It's getting a buff to damage, which compensates for the monster chaos resist increases. I think the skill, from a damage perspective, will be about as good as it is now. The big change, though, now gains additional radius as the gem levels up to +6 at gem level 20 from +3. This is a buff. This really is a buff. Caustic Arrow is already a pretty good skill, and it's going to be dealing quite a lot of damage if you can get all of this together. However, the skill is tricky to scale. It's not an ailment, but it scales off levels and chaos damage over time multiplier. It doesn't scale off a lot of the things that bow skills normally scale off, so you're going to want some pretty unusual bow crafts for it. As a particularly messy point that is not at all intuitive, I've already mentioned that this skill doesn't inflict ailments, it doesn't deal or anything like them, but it works with Swift Affliction, which is just confusing, because you always think of Swift Affliction as an ailment support gem. Anyways, that confusion out of the way, Discharge. This is a buff, but probably the skill still sucks, I think. I just don't think that the amount of damage Discharge does is worth all the hoops you need to go through in order to make it happen, and I think if you want to jump through hoops in order to get a single monumental hit on an enemy, I think that the skill you should be using is Divine Ire instead. Elemental Hit has been nerfed. It has dropped 18% in damage. However, I am still confident that this skill is going to be good. I am still intending to league start as Tri-Elemental, Elemental Equilibrium, Elemental Hit Mines, and that is one hell of a mess to say. It's a tongue twister. Tri-Elemental, Elemental Equilibrium, Ele Hit Mines. Ugh. Icicle Mine. Icicle Mine is getting nerfed hard, but will probably still be good. The skill was absolutely absurd in the Blight League. It was way too good, and it's being brought down to earth, but I think it will still be a very strong skill. Lancing Steel. Now, I said something about skills that don't need nerfs getting nerfed. This is a dumpster tier skill, and it's gaining a couple of percent damage. Like this is less than a 3% increase in damage at level 20. So going from 175% of base to 180%, That's less than a 3% increase in damage, because 3% of 175% would be 5.25%. As a drawback, it's getting a base attack time multiplier of 85% from 80%. That is basically meaning that instead of... So if your base attack weapon... If your weapon takes 1 second to attack, it's going from 800 milliseconds to 850 milliseconds. That's a 6.25% decrease. So essentially, at the top end, this is getting about a 3.5% nerf, according to my mental maths. Lancing Steel was not in a good place to begin with, and it doesn't need to get worse like that. The changes to the quality bonus don't make up for it, and so Lancing Steel goes from dumpster tier to a dumpster tier slightly minus. Anyways, Lightning Spire Trap is being taken out the back and shot in the head. Then its corpse is being dug up and being shot again. This skill was one of the most subtly overpowered skills in the game. A lot of players never really played around with it, didn't realize how busted it was. But it's no longer busted. It's probably going straight from top tier to dumpster tier in one shot. And yeah, I don't think there's any... We're going from no reason not to use it to no reason to even consider using this skill at all, I think. I'm open to being proven wrong on that. If you think that Lightning Spire Trap is still justified to use, then by all means try it and prove me wrong. But I think this one is straight into the dustbin of history. Next up, Molten Strike is being changed. And this seems really cool. It's getting a few percent extra damage. 7% extra damage, 130%, plus 7% would be 139.1, so we'll just call that an even 7. However, we're going to see Point Blank is getting nerfed, and that is going to be an absolute killer for Molten Strike. Molten Strike is not actually getting buffed overall. It is going to be worse than it is currently, and nothing in this change is going to fix that. For Molten Strike to be worth playing around with again, I feel that these base damage numbers would need to be in the 180 range. At that point, I would consider trying it again. But even then, I still don't think it would get there. But at 139%, it is just a flat no. Okay, so next up we have... Orbistorms is getting nerfed at low level with its striking slower at low level, which will mean that players will no longer be finding it to be absolutely nuts when they're leveling, as it had been. I don't know whether it will still be worth using leveling at all, but it's certainly no longer going to be the god tier leveling skill that obsoletes all other leveling skills like it has been for a period of time. Anyways, that is Orbistorms. Next up we have Rain of Arrows. Rain of Arrows, this is a buff. It's just getting a flat 20% more multiplier to all the damage it does. This is powerful. Rain of Arrows was already a serviceable skill. I think it's going to go from serviceable to strong. It may even end up in the top tier of skills. Gonna have to play around with it a bit. I'm not the biggest expert on building Rain of Arrows characters, so I assume some of the people watching this will know more than I do on that front, but I think it's going to be pretty good. Specters. Now, Raise Spectre. Raise Spectre is being nerfed in a very gentle way, but a meaningful one. What's going to happen with Raise Spectre is that you will still get your powerful third Spectre, but you'll get it much later in your character's progression. You're pretty much going to need to either be using a leveled Empower, or a faceted fossil crafted item, or Cold Iron Point, or you're going to need to be using an item level 86 helmet in order to get your hands on that extra Spectre that you get when you hit gem level 25. It's still very achievable, but you'll get it later in your character's progression. On the flip side, however, Necromancers can still get it at a reasonable time frame. I quite like the approach they've taken to Raise Spectre here. They've recognised that it was not the thing making minion builds overpowered, and so they've given it a slight dampening on its power level, but they haven't gone out and smashed it around the head. It will still certainly be a very useful skill. Do note that this skill is affected by the nerfs to Feeding Frenzy, which we'll get to later. Next up we have Zombies. Raise Zombie is possibly the most overpowered skill in the game at the moment, or well, with the exception of Tornado Shot, and it is getting gutted. It is getting absolutely gutted. However, it is so overpowered that I think it may well survive these nerfs. So, we'll see here that base zombie damage has been reduced 25%. The zombie slam ability starts out with a radius of 17 instead of 28, and the radius of the slam scales, but it only scales up to 76%. Now, some quick mental maths: 17 units is 289 is 17 squared. 279 squared plus 76% is something of the order 490. The square root of 490 is 22. So you can see here that there is a big decrease in the slam radius at all realistic gem levels. This is going to be pretty significant. Only we mentioned that there's 30% less base damage effectiveness at level 1, although it does sort of recover that over time. Additionally, no longer grants zombies more life as the gem levels, although the zombies do continue to gain more base life as the gems level. So, zombies are one of those things that you sort of take them out the back and you shoot them, and they sort of get up, and then they move back towards you, but they come towards you and they're moving slower than they used to. That's what's happening here. Raise Zombie, I think, is going to go from a top tier skill to a serviceable skill. But we're going to have to find that out in practice. This is the change that I'm least sure of assessing. Anyways, let's go from something that's been nerfed from God tier to serviceable, quite possibly, to something that's been nerfed from God tier to unplayable, and that is Scourge Era. Yeah, press F to pay respects to Scourge Era. This skill in one single swoop, I think, is dead. Which is actually probably a net positive for the game because it was so brokenly overpowered for so long. But I don't think that people are going to be playing it in 3.9. I'm open to being proven wrong. I'm open to seeing people do some sort of crazy chaos damage shenanigans with it, but let's just see. I'm going to personally predict that I think the skill is dead. Next up we have Venom Gaia. Venom Gaia is only getting numerical changes, and on their own they wouldn't be enough to make the skill great. They might make the skill go from disappointing to serviceable. However, the big change to Venom Gaia is the support gems. And there is a support gem that is being added. The old Fork Plus has been renamed Awakened Fork Support. This is going to be, for Venom Gaia, the moment that gives it a chance to come out into its own and to become a real powerhouse skill. If Venom Gaia has a future, that future is Awakened Fork, and this extra damage makes it more likely that it will have a future. I think that this has some potential, and I think that it's something that you can definitely consider, even as a league starter, because I think that the Awakened support gems, they're going to be a major investment to buy, but I don't think they're going to be unaffordable. So for that reason, I think Venom Gaia is looking a lot better than it did in 3.9. Oh, sorry, in 3.8. And for that matter, in 3.8, it looked pretty good at first. It just didn't end up playing very well. But yeah, I think Venom Gaia is looking pretty impressive. Now we have the support gem balance. I already mentioned Feeding Frenzy is being nerfed. And yes, Feeding Frenzy is being nerfed. It's being nerfed in every possible way, but I think all of this is stuff that needs to happen. The gem was so overpowered that even if your goal was not to have aggressive minions, you felt compelled to use Feeding Frenzy and put up with the fact that the minions were now aggressive, because the numbers on it was just so damn high. Well, it's not going to be like that. We have lesser multiple projectile support next. It's being buffed, and so is also volley support, which is related. I think that both of these support gems are still inferior to the alternatives. The alternatives that you would consider using are greater multiple projectiles, fork, and chain. I think that all three of those alternatives are just better than lesser multiple projectiles and volley. Fork has better damage, and chain and GMP both have much better coverage. So for that reason, I think don't bother using lesser multiple projectile support. You will continue to use it, of course, until you unlock greater multiple projectiles in the sort of the end of the first third of the campaign. Next up, we have Mirage Archer. Mirage Archer has been so overpowered that every traditional bow build, when I say traditional bow build, I mean ones that don't use funky methods like mines or ballistas to deliver their shots. But I feel like every single bow build has felt compelled to use Mirage Archer. It has just been so powerful for so long that it's just been mandatory. Well, it needed this nerf, and it still remains too good not to use. If you're playing a traditional archer character, this nerf is going to sting, but you still use Mirage Archer because it is still better than any of the other alternative supports you could use in its place. And Onslaught Support. Onslaught Support is being taken out the back and shot in the head. Then the corpse is being dug up and it is being shot again. Onslaught Support is dead. There is no reason to consider using this skill, this support gem, I think, on any main skill. You might conceivably use it in some niche cases as on a build that has one primary skill that it uses to attack and then has something else. One example that might work would be old school Reeve builds might use Reeve to actually make their attacks, and that wouldn't use Onslaught on it, and then use a separate copy of Valreeve which had Onslaught on it. You could conceivably do something weird and wonderful like that, but broadly speaking, I think Onslaught Support is dead. Next up, we have Point Blank Support, and I'll address that when we talk passive tree balance. Basically, what's happening here is that the Point Blank Keystone was so good that you couldn't not use it on a lot of builds, and it's being nerfed pretty hard. It's going from, instead of being 150% damage multiplier on enemies that are close to you, tailing off to 50%, which is a drawback, on enemies that are further from you. It's going to have 40% reduced effectiveness of that, 40% reduced scaling. So that means 130% on enemies close and 70% on enemies that are distant. It's still probably so good that you need to use it, but this means Point Blank Support is completely dead because all this does now is deal 30% more damage to targets that are at super close range. You can always find another support gem that will add more than 30% more damage. So for that reason, Point Blank Support is not worth considering, in my opinion, at all. We have some ascendancy changes. There is a minor slap to Necromancer, and there is a huge but niche buff for some Slayer builds. Slayer builds that use the Golden Rule unique jewel, which you will know if you're building around that. It's a pretty niche item. They got a huge buff here, but for other people, it's just not clear what that means. If you can't see what this does, then that's fine. It's only for niche interactions. Now, next up, we have some discussion of item balance. There's some changes to bow and wand bases, but essentially they're better than they used to be, wands by a lot. Physical damage wands might actually be viable in this league because they're getting a 20% more multiplier to their base damage, which is basically 20% more damage for many of them. Now, when I'm talking about physical damage wanders, we're talking physical wanders, we're talking ones that scale physical damage, we're talking ones that deal poison via physical and chaos damage, and we're also talking ones that use elements, so physical damage and then use various sources of gain X% of your physical damage as added of a certain element. All of these types of wanders have been buffed, whereas the traditionally popular elemental wanders that typically use the wand Piscator's Vigil gain, at least early on in the league, they gain nothing from these changes. Overall though, I think this is going to increase the diversity of wands that are being used. Now we have the crafted mods. Now, I think that the general approach that GGG are taking here is removing clear best choices that eclipse all others when it comes to crafting. The goal is to make more sources of items viable than is presently the case. In the current meta, it's pretty much wrong to craft a chest piece for an armor and life character by any means other than using pristine and serrated fossils together on an attack build at least. There's just nothing else that can compete with that. And by virtue of nerfing those particular fossils, what's happening is that we're going to see considerably more flexibility in what is able to craft able to craft a viable chess piece. So for that reason, I'm pretty actually interested in seeing how these play out in practice. Some of the most powerful mods in the game that were available for crafting are gone. Of particular note, +1 curse on chess pieces is going legacy, and veiled damage plus ailment hybrid on bows are gone, although bows get something else which compensate for many builds. Elemental penetration is being nerfed. The double damage mod on the shaper items is being smashed, but is such a powerful role that it is still going to be a tier 1 role. It is still going to be a very high power role when you get it. There is a 25% haircut to the damage dealt by dexterity stacking bows, which is still strong. 37.5% would probably have been enough to really put a dent in the archetype, but I think that 25% leaves dexterity stacking bows as a very strong option. In interesting buffs, Shaper and Elder armors can grant absolute immunity to a type of reflect, physical or elemental, and a pair of rings can grant the same immunity as well. Or alternately, if you don't get the pair of them, just having one ring that has reduced reflect damage taken will be really meaningful now as well. That's going to be an interesting change. The other thing that came up that was a bit of a buff is that the added physical and chaos flat damage to spells on weapons have been increased considerably. These were previously dumpster tier elder prefixes. They might now be good enough to consider using. Fossils. Now, I've said for a long time that fossils were so powerful when they were introduced that they essentially rendered a lot of other types of crafting irrelevant. You basically used fossils for everything, and the only purpose Chaos Orb served was that, one, you could use them for Zana mods, and two, you could use them to trade to other players to buy their fossils if they were less knowledgeable about crafting than you were. This is perhaps being changed a little bit. A lot of the most powerful fossil mods are being nerfed hard. Pristine fossils have been taken out the back and shot. Serrated fossils have not just been taken out and shot, but they have been thrown into, they've been sort of thrown into a black hole as well. However, as much as I'm saying that about serrated fossils on the armor pieces, they will still have uses on weapons. So don't throw out all of your serrated fossils in the new league. They'll still be useful, and it's still my opinion actually that despite these nerfs, fossils will remain really, really powerful. I do want to add that there's been something added as a last-minute change as well, and that is some changes to prismatic fossils. And this actually impacts my league start plans, because I was thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to go elemental hit, and I'm going to craft a very basic bow that has the two prismatic fossil exclusive mods on it. One of them is a super high tier of weapon elemental damage, and the other one is universal elemental penetration. As it turns out, both of these mods are being nerfed numerically, but they're still going to be good. And so for that reason, I'm still going to feel that the correct way to craft my desired bow at league start is going to still be using prismatic fossils, despite the nerf. It's still going to be better than anything I could realistically expect to get with either Alt Regal crafting or with Chaos Orb crafting. I think that's something important to keep in mind. Some of the old crafting methods were so overpowered that they rendered other methods just basically wrong choices. Nowadays, the fossils are going to still be strong, but they're not going to be so strong that nothing else can be used. Okay, now we have other item changes. There's a couple of mods that are being changed here. Spell damage rolls are being improved out of sight, and this means that the Road to Power Divination card, which grants a runic one-handed weapon, this is getting a lot better. A lot better than it used to be. Keep your eye out for this item, for this divination card set. It drops in Castle Ruins in the current state of the game. Who knows where it'll drop in 3.9, but it'll probably be Castle Ruins. And it really does drop. It will really be significant. Runic weapons. Runic is the highest tier of spell damage mod. So getting that on a scepter with high degree of flat added elemental damage or something like that, it's going to really send your character's power level rocketing up. Shaper and Elder Scarabs, as we expected, got much better. We've got some new numbers on that down here. And my first divination card is being temporarily disabled from dropping because tier 16 Chateau maps are no longer a thing in this league. So we'll find out what happens with that. But in the short term, it's being disabled. We'll find out where the future is on that. Additionally, the Sexton upgrade recipe is gone. And I hadn't noticed that on my first read through. So that's something that's going to be of interest. Next up, we have unique item changes. Hyri's Ire is being nerfed. It's losing a third of its damage. And you know what? It's still overpowered. That chest is insane. And it will still continue to be insane despite losing a third of its damage. The other thing that's happening with it, though, is that the range of the rolls is increasing tremendously. This means that it will be much harder to get one that is well divined. However, as I've said before, I'll say it again, Hyri's Ire is still going to be overpowered. It is still going to be the best in slot armor for any character that is using a bow and scaling cold damage in this league. This is going to be your endgame dream armor to get still. So, now that we've said that Hyri's Ire is still overpowered despite the nerf, Snakebite is the one that caught my attention here. Snakebite is being changed. It is granting 5% to damage over time multiplier per frenzy charge you have. This seems build enabling to me. 40 to 50% more poison damage on raiders, maybe 30, 35, 40% on an assassin. This seems good. This seems really good. I'm not sure if these are going to be rarer or if they're still going to be a super common unique, but I think this is going to be something that will have a lot of potential uses early in the league. And potentially even as a, if it remains common, it's something you can conceivably get 2 desired corrupt implicits on. So that's going to be really impressive. Monster changes. Bosses will be harder in Axe, and this is going to cause an interesting dynamic for new players, where they're going to go up against a boss and say, holy shit, I can't beat this guy, I need to farm more. And that's going to be something that'll be quite a game-changing experience for those players. Many people will be up to the challenge, I think. They'll just go, okay, Mavale kicked my ass, well, I'm just going to go back to the Caverns of Anger, I'm going to kill a few more monsters, I'm going to gain 2 levels, then I'm going to take her on again, and you know what? This time I've improved. This time my character's better, this time I got some better gear, and I can kick that damn fish lady's ass this time. And eventually they'll beat it. I think that'll be a real positive to see, that there'll be these bosses that will be nastier than they used to be. Veterans won't care. This is going to have no impact on us. This is a change made to change the expectations of new players, to get them used to having occasional failures while they're leveling. We'll adapt, though, as veterans. It seems silly that in the current state of the game, Innocence and Doedre are the hardest gatekeeper bosses by far, and Gruthkul and Valentia are probably the hardest optional bosses, although you can just come back to them later. But Doedre and Innocence are just really difficult bosses that you must fight at a certain time, and it seems better if the hardest bosses, if the gatekeeper bosses, are changed to be act bosses instead. The new skills on monsters and bosses are going to kill people in the hardcore solo self-found race. This is going to be funny. I'm just going to be that evil person sitting there and laughing at them. In the map changes section, Atlas bonus determines Zana mod access. We've learnt that now. So get that number up. You need to do so anyway because it determines your map sustain. Legion might be locked behind a very complete Atlas. We'll have to find that out. Elder Guardians that are awarded from Zana's missions will have map mods, but you can also get Elder mods Elder influence maps by other means, and they will be tradable items. Cortex will be more common. Cortex will still be a very, very difficult fight for people to try and beat. Something that's a real, it's something that if you can beat Cortex, then you're quite good at this game. Lastly, synthesis unique maps are now available as tradable unique items, and the only way you can acquire them is by killing the bosses of tier 11 and higher maps, or tier 14 and higher for the Cortex. This is a great change. These are going to be valuable. If you've never run one of the synthesis maps, they are really quite lucrative. They drop a lot of loot, especially if they have favorable mods on them. So the way that these roll, if you're not familiar with them, they will have, I believe, between 6 and 8 difficulty mods rolled onto them, and then they'll have 2 or 3 reward mods on them. These reward mods vary greatly in power. Some of them, though, will have tremendous effects on on the amount of loot that you get. One that I got was synthesized monsters have a 3% chance to drop a shaper item. And I ran this map not realizing just how good that was going to be. Ran through it, and I think I ended up leaving with something like 10 pieces of shaper jewelry from this run, as well as leaving behind a whole lot of other shaper items on the ground. Additionally, Zana can sell you these maps as well, but when they say very, very lucky, I generally assume 1 very would mean that you'll see one of these in a league if you do a lot of Zana missions. 2 veries is where you're getting to the point that someone in your guild will have this happen to them once in a league. There's also some late-minute changes that have been made. This is a document that is continually evolving, and bleed and poison suffixes on weapons are being buffed. This is a buff. And weapon elemental damage on weapons is being increased. I think I mentioned that quickly when talking about prismatic fossils. It's going from a dumpster tier mod to maybe being solid, whereas the prismatic fossil version is being nerfed but will still be good. Anyways, there's a lot to be excited about in here. I've only discussed the things that I found interesting. I know that I will have missed some things, so definitely have a read of this yourself. And fire away below with your comments, your questions, and your feedback.